with a lower relative internal price for cloth. Right? So the relative price of cloth internally is now lower. So what can we say? If we think about internally, the relative price of cloth has fallen, right? Because of the tariff. So what will domestic firms do? How will they respond to this lower relative price for cloth? I'm sorry? Okay, what happens to output? Let's think about output. Okay, so what we should see is that the supply of cloth should fall and the supply of wine should increase. So if domestic prices are rising because we're holding out some exports, then we're holding out some imports. So domestic prices are rising. Now, from an economy perspective, we want to produce more wine. In order to produce more wine, we have to produce less cloth. Remember, we're operating along our production possibilities from here. Okay? So to come back to your question, we're increasing the supply of wine because of the higher price that's associated with it. Why do we have a higher price? Well, we've got a demand curve, right? We've got a supply curve, which was both domestic supply plus imports. We've reduced the amount of imports because of the price. Curve shifts to the left. Supply curve shifts to the left. That's going to raise the price. Why don't domestic producers increase their price by 15%? Because there would be excess demand. You can charge a higher price. You can charge 20% more. Remember, all you've got to do is replace domestic production with the amount of imports that you're holding out, and you get the 20% higher price. So you end up with a really nice situation if you're a wine producer. Notice also that what happens here is that if we thought about the relative supply of cloth, it goes down. So notice we started by saying, let's hold the external equilibrium world price constant and find out how domestic producers will respond to the imposition of this tariff. We're going to produce less cloth. We're going to produce more wine. So how do we reflect this change? How do we reflect this change in relative supply of cloth in our world relative supply and demand diagram? Because Portugal is clearly producing less cloth and more wine. So this says that the relative supply curve of cloth will shift to the left. Now, so far we've talked about the producers, but it's also true that consumers face a different set of relative prices. So again, we want to start any world relative price. Remember, we're trying to find the effect on the world price, not the internal price. And so again, we've got the internal price, relative price of cloth, falls, which means what about the demand for cloth? It will increase, and the demand for wine will fall, which of course implies that the relative demand for cloth increases, which implies that the relative demand curve for cloth shifts right. At every world relative price, we now have an increase in the world relative demand for cloth. Okay. So what happens to the world, the external relative price of cloth? So what did we just say? The world, remember, this is the relative supply of cloth. So the relative supply of cloth was reduced, and the relative demand for cloth was increased, which means the equilibrium world price for cloth will increase. Yes? World, not wine. Yes, these are all world. So notice what happens when we put this tariff on. In Portugal's case, the internal price of cloth goes down, but the external price of cloth goes up. So we get a different effect. Portugal, here, by imposing a tariff, has been able to affect both its internal prices and also the external price. This is the external price, yes. Yes, at any given relative price, we can say that. Yes, this is not the most efficient allocation of global resources. We don't know, however, that means that the relative quantity in the world has gone down. Remember, this is relative, not absolute. So the relative quantities, because we have counter or opposing forces coming from the supply and the demand side. So these are external prices. By the way, the reason we know that they're external prices, these are world relative supply and demand curves, not country supply and demand curves. If these were the supply and demand curves for Portugal, then they would be internal prices that they're generating. These, though, are world relative outputs. So notice that if the world equilibrium price didn't change, production in England will not be affected by the tariff. Now, once Portugal changes its production and consumption choices, then that will come back and affect imports and exports and change the world relative quantities. And again, we don't know whether the world relative quantity of cloth will go up or down. Depends upon whether the effect on consumption is larger or smaller than the effect on supply. So what else do we know? From an international trade perspective, again, this doesn't tell us anything about what's happening inside Portugal from the implication of the tariff. But what we can see is that from an external point of view, the relative price of cloth fell. So that implies that the terms of trade for Portugal also declined. So Portugal, I'm sorry, they increased, didn't they? The other declined. The terms of trade for Portugal increased, which means, of course, that their aggregate economic welfare increased from the change in relative prices, the external relative prices. Again, we need to make a distinction between what happens internally and what happens because of the international trade effect. Yes. Oh, I'm sorry. Oh, okay, so I had it right the first time. The other first time. So the relative price increases, right. The terms of trade decrease. No, I'm sorry. Jeez. Okay. It's Thursday. What can I tell you? Okay, so the relative price of cloth increases. The terms of trade increase for Portugal, and therefore there's also an increase in aggregate economic welfare in Portugal. Notice that also means that the relative price of wine falls, which means that the terms of trade, the international trade effects for England, also decline. So England's economic welfare is lower. So in essence, what Portugal has done here, by imposing a tariff on English imports, it's managed to increase its economic welfare from a terms of trade perspective, but it does so at the expense of England, the exporting country that the tariff is, whose goods the tariff is applied against. So, yes?
Is that why now the developers are asking for free trade not upon Chinese exports?
Yes? Yes, ma'am.
When you say that Portugal has increased economic welfare, then don't Portuguese consumers, are they worse off because now they can buy less wine at a high price, so their consumption price is actually reduced?
But that's from the higher internal price, right, of wine. So we have to make, just like we did with economic growth, we have to make a distinction between what happens to economic welfare because of the economic growth and then what additional effects we get because of the international trade implications. We have to do the same thing here. We have to make a distinction between whether the country's better off or worse off by applying a tariff internally. Consumers of wine are clearly much worse off. But there's also a terms of trade effect. That even if we're worse off internally, the terms of trade effect reduces the decline in our aggregate or overall economic welfare. So they can work in opposite directions.
If they can work in opposite directions, how do you ever know that on that side you come out in positive or negative? Right? How do you know whether that loss in welfare due to consumers paying more will offset that entirely?
The improvement in the terms of trade?
Yeah, what the gain in terms of trade.
Well, that's primarily an empirical question, right? So, I mean, you need to try and measure the different orders of magnitude. But in general, what we can say is the following. Economic growth is always good, right? Even if part of it is offset by a deterioration in your terms of trade. Tariffs almost always reduce economic welfare, domestic economic welfare, even if there's some offset, small offset to that because of better terms of trade. Now, it's not universally true, but it's true in almost every case. So the tariff itself, we know, reduces economic welfare because it gives us a misallocation of resources. We'll be able to see this in a different way a little bit later in the course. So in this case, I would say the net effect over both is a reduction in aggregate economic welfare. But here, what we want to emphasize is that the terms of trade can actually help for Portugal. Is there another question? I thought I saw another hand. Yes? That's right. So by imposing a tariff, you've changed the incentives for domestic producers. With a higher price for wine, you want now to produce more wine. And with a lower relative price for cloth, you'll produce less cloth. Right. So notice that the tariff itself changes the incentives for producers. It also changes the incentives for consumers. They're buying relatively more cloth and relatively less wine. Okay, let's see what we have here. Okay. So the tariff decreases the relative supply of cloth, increases the relative demand, and that leads to an increase in the world equilibrium price. We get an improvement in Portugal's terms of trade and a deterioration in England's terms of trade. Yes, they will change. Yeah, sure. You've changed the world price, so you've changed the slope of the ISO value budget line that would be affected in England. No, it's not. You mean this diagram? So what happens? Notice that when the relative price of cloth goes up, so here's the supply decision, right? So what we want to do is focus on production decisions if we're going to think about what producers in England do. So this shift to the left, to the red line, is the shift that is caused by Portugal's cloth and wine producers because of the imposition of the tariff. Now, from there, the relative price of cloth begins to rise. As the relative price of cloth begins to rise, this is remember the external price, so this is the price that we know that English businesses are faced with. They want to produce more cloth and less wine. That's a movement up along this supply curve. As the price goes up, we move up along it, and we would see an increase in the relative quantity of cloth being produced in the world. Well, we might end up with a decrease because Portugal is responding to the tariff. Right? So you got two price effects here. Internally, you've got a price effect. For Portugal, you have a price effect that says produce less cloth and more wine. In England, you get a price effect that says produce more cloth and less wine. So what's the net effect? You got curves moving in different directions, so I can't tell you what the net effect is without more information. Anything else? Okay. Now, one of the important things about the terms of trade effect is that it actually depends upon how big the country is, or how big or small the country is that is actually imposing the tariff. Right? Now, when we talk about big and small here, we're not talking about geographic size. We're not talking about population. We're not talking about GDP. So we're not talking about any of those things. What we're talking about is this country a large or small component of the total world supply, or the total world demand of this in these imported and exported goods? Right? So it turns out that the United States is a large importer in the sense of being a large proportion of world demand for many, many products. And so it has been calculated that if the U.S. were to place a uniform 20% tariff on imported goods, that the prices of imports themselves would increase by about, would improve the terms of trade by about 15%. So that's a pretty substantial move. Now, let's think of another country. If Luxembourg imposes a 20% tariff, its terms of trade will not change. Luxembourg is way too small a country in terms of imports and exports on a world basis that it's just not going to have an effect in terms of either the price of its exports. So it's just not going to matter, right? So you get an internal effect without getting an external effect. So small countries, and again, we'll come back to this a little bit later to see what the actual implications of that are. Small countries that impose tariffs cannot exercise, or do not exercise, any monopoly power. So they're not able to influence prices in the world market by their own behavior. The larger and larger the country becomes in terms of its percentage of world trade in a particular good or service, the greater the monopoly power that it has, and therefore the bigger the influence it will have on world prices. When you come right down to it, with very few exceptions, there's probably only 4 or 5, maybe 6 countries that would truly be considered large countries. U.S. would clearly fall into that category. The European Union or the Euro region would probably fall in that area. China would for some goods and services, but not all. Brazil would for some goods and services, but not all. Russia would for some goods and services, but not all. Saudi Arabia would for some, but not all. Obviously oil, but you begin to trail off very, very quickly after that. So most countries in the world are actually considered to be relatively small countries in terms of trade volumes. Okay, any questions about tariffs or the effects of tariffs on terms of trade before we go into export subsidies? Okay, so remember, an export subsidy is just a payment that is made to a firm that actually exports. So once again, we need to think about internal prices and external prices. And so our external prices is just whatever the relative price of cloth was. And before the imposition of the subsidy, internal prices will be the same. But now we're giving a payment to a firm that exports. So in Portugal's case, of course, that's cloth. So cloth prices in Portugal are going to rise by 20%. A Portuguese cloth producer is saying, wow, if I sell it in England, the government will give me a 20% payment. If I sell it domestically, I don't get the payment. So what do? I try and sell more abroad. As I'm increasing my exports, pushing more abroad, there's less available in the domestic economy, which is going to drive up the internal price by 20% as well, until we get to equal prices in both markets. So now notice that the relative price, the internal relative price, is now higher than the external relative price. So we can go through the same exercise we did with tariffs to see what happens for domestic producers and then domestic consumers. So here, the internal relative price rose. And so this means that in Portugal, producers will want to make more cloth and less wine, which means that the relative supply of cloth has increased, and the relative supply curve for cloth shifts to the right. So cloth producers are getting a higher income from each unit of cloth, which induces them to produce more cloth. If we thought about consumers, however, the internal relative price of